How does PwC take your company to the leading edge? They bring the sharpest minds in tech to your team, so you can bring the ideas that will transform your business. They're passionate about your industry, so you can walk into any room with every advantage. And they're with you every step of the way, so you can know you're headed in the right direction. PwC builds for what's next, so you can get there now. Get started at pwc.com/us/leading edge.
This episode is brought to you by Temptations Cat Treats. Your cat will come running for the perfectly irresistible Temptations Creamy Puree and Temptations Lickable Spoon Cat Treats. The best time to feed lickable cat treats to your cat is anytime. Feed by hand for a playful moment, in a bowl for a creamy treat, or as a topper to make mealtime fun. Visit temptationstreats.com to learn more.
Welcome to Farm Here Daily, a field-forward podcast. I'm David Geiger, your host. I've been on Iowa TV and radio for the last decade, and I'm very excited to keep up this new podcast, Farm Here Daily. Today, we'll be talking about ethanol, E15 year-round. Monte Shaw with the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association is here. We'll also cover planting and alfalfa stands over in eastern Iowa. Rebecca Vittetoe with ISU Extension will go over that. Please be sure to like and follow the podcast and our social media at Feel Forward. We'd love to have you join our community, keeping folks in Iowa informed about what is going on that affects our farmers. And joining with us on Farm Here Daily, we have Monte Shaw, Executive Director of the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association. Monte, always love talking to you, and we have some updates, some news in the world of ethanol around E15 and year-round nationwide. What's been your perspective? What have you seen lately on that?
Well, as you well know, we've been trying to get permanent nationwide access to E15 year-round for longer than I would care to admit. I do feel we're getting closer to that, which is going to take some action by Congress. But in the meantime, here more recently, the Trump administration did announce an emergency summer waiver for some regulations that would allow nationwide E15 sales to continue throughout the summer of 2025, so the whole year. So that was really good news. Retailers aren't going to have to bag the pumps. Consumers aren't going to pull up there and say, "Hey, where'd my 15 to 20 cents a gallon savings go?" But that really kind of keeps us from taking a step backwards, which is important. But we really need, as you know from following the corn markets, we really need to take a step forwards. And so the pressure on Congress is mounting. And I don't know. I'm feeling lucky this year. I think sometime between now and the end of the year, we have a real shot.
Now, the Midwest has really led the way on this. We have already set a permanent year-round E15 for, I believe, 8 states or so have joined some sort of coalition. You can correct me on that. How many years has that been? 1 or 2? Well,
they asked for it about 3 years ago, and I won't get into the weeds. You'd need a 12-hour podcast to do that. But there's a provision in the Clean Air Act that allows governors to make certain requests that the EPA kind of has to grant. And again, without getting the weeds, they were able to request that the regulations for E10 and E15 be equalized. And when you do that, a lot of people think, E15 is banned in the summer. No, it's not. You just have to meet a certain volatility limit, and they put it in. And without ever really meaning to, the bottom line is E10 and E15 were regulated differently. The oil guys would send up the gasoline you could blend with E10 legally. If you blended that same gasoline with E15 during the summer months, it would be illegal. Not because it's bad, it just has a different volatility limit, and they set up something that worked for one and not the other. So the governors were 8 governors, Midwest governors, led by Iowa Governor Kim Reynolds, they banded together as bipartisan. And they said, hey, we want to equalize these, because if you equalize them, then no matter what gasoline they send up the pipeline, you can blend it for both E10 and E15. In a way, that's exactly a different mechanism. That's exactly what the summertime emergency waiver does that the president just did. So 8 states had that locked in place, and this was actually going to be the first year that went into effect. So those states were going to be okay for year-round E15 in the summer of 2025, but not the other 42. And well more than half the stations are outside of those 8 states. So while we're happy to have the certainty in Iowa, we also sell about 98%, 96% of the ethanol we produce in Iowa we sell outside of Iowa. So we need that year-round E15 everywhere, and you need that certainty if you're going to get new retailers.
Now tell me about, because I appreciate the reminder that this is supposed to be the first year for that Midwestern year-round aspect of E15. Have you seen a pretty big change in the retailers in Iowa specifically?
Well, we have, but I also, I guess once again need to credit Governor Kim Reynolds. 3 years ago, she passed a biofuels bill. It was called the Governor's Biofuels Bill, and inside of that was an E15 access standard. And what it said is all new stations or stations that have compatible equipment, they're not, and I think there were some exemptions for some small stations as well. But basically, by January 1 of 2026, you have to offer E15 from one pump. It's not a consumer is not required to buy it. You can offer other products, but you have to make E15 available. And so we've seen the number of stations in Iowa offering E15 probably a year to 18 months ago. It would have been around 300, 350 stations. And today we believe it's over 900. And by the end of this year, we fully expect it to be, 15, 1600 and being, probably 80% of the stations that, the ones that don't get the waivers. So we've seen a huge increase here, but the only reason you could kind of do that on one hand without having to undo it is because of that permanent year-round E15 solution that those Midwest states have. And that's just what we want for everybody else. E15 is generally sells, depends on where you go, but it generally sells for 15 or 20 cents a gallon less than E10, which is another 30 or 40 or 50 cents a gallon less than the ethanol-free gas. So right now, probably 98% of our fuel in the United States is blended with ethanol, mostly E10. If we can get permanent year-round E15, so retailers know, hey, if I go do this, I'm not going to have to go bag the pump or turn it on and off. So if we get permanent year-round E15, why wouldn't you sell the product that's 15 to 20 cents a gallon cheaper, and you actually get a little extra octane too as a bonus? So I personally believe that E15 will absolutely become the new normal, like E10 is now, once we get it permanent. But we've been fighting that battle for literally a decade. But for the first time ever, we are seeing some support within the refiners and others to get this done. So I don't want to jinx us. I'm knocking on wood right now, but I never before did I feel like the dominoes were lining up, and I just feel like we came close last December in a bill in Congress, and at the last minute it got pulled out with some other stuff. I just think that people are kind of like, we've just been pushing, and how farmers are. We just push and push and work and work and work. And I think Congress, it took a decade, but I think they are finally worn down, and we're going to get this thing done. My fingers are definitely crossed.
I really appreciate that breakdown, because I've been noticing more and more E15 at the pumps when I fill up with gas, and I've been using E15 for a couple years now. And that kind of leads to my next question, which is there's been a bit of a shift in marketing as well, because we know E15 is safe. We've been using it for a pretty long time. We know virtually all cars on the road today, unless you're riding a vintage or a restored vehicle that has an old engine of some kind before 2003, all the cars now on the roads pretty much can use it. But there's kind of that new is scary type mentality. And so some of the labeling, I think, was potentially not as cohesive for consumers. And I've noticed that it's not as apparent at the pump, which suits me just fine, because I just go grab the cheapest one myself.
Yeah, I mean, I think, you have a federally required label, and it's kind of annoying. It's orange and black, and, it looks like a warning label when it shouldn't, because E15 is the most tested fuel literally in our nation's history. We now have, trillions of miles on it without a single reported issue. And believe me, if there had been, we'd know about it, because some of the refiners would make a big deal about it. So it's a great fuel. It saves you money, good for your car. It's obviously more renewable, made from corn. So here in the Midwest, we care about that. It reduces tailpipe emissions. It reduces carbon emissions. It's made in America. We don't import it. I mean, it checks important boxes from the right side of the political spectrum all the way to the left side of the political spectrum. So it's just pretty straightforward there. So you mentioned the labels. I think originally you actually saw some retailers, it's like, okay, we're going to try to sell E15, but we don't want anyone to be mad. So they like over labeled it, or they moved it off to the side where people thought it was different. Oh, if it's over there, do I need a flex fuel vehicle?
Sometimes it looked like diesel,
Yeah, like E85, and you have that. So I think now they're realizing, hey, it's just another product. Consumers are actually pretty smart. If they can go to a restaurant and look at a soda pop machine dispenser, that has about 10 different buttons and levers and different things, they can figure out 2 or 3 choices of fuel. I mean, come on, if you can drive a car and you can't figure that out, then maybe you need to give your license back.
You're exactly right. In the gas station itself, you have the soda. It's literally the same thing.
Exactly. So the other thing I'd say is, we're also, now that you have permanent year-round E15 in these 8 states, in those states, we're starting to see what we call replacement. And that is, they're not adding E15 as an option, they're just replacing E10. And if a retailer came up to me and said, Monte, I've got 2 tanks, what should I sell? You might be surprised to learn. I'd say, well, you need to offer E15 because it's the lowest priced option for basically, like you mentioned, all the cars on the road today, unless they're really old. And then, if you want, offer a clear premium, a no ethanol premium. I personally put ethanol in my premium, but if you want, because you do have people out there who unfortunately have been convinced by false advertising over the years that you can't put ethanol in certain things, but you have cars that need premium, so offer a premium. You have the small and off-road engines that you're not supposed to put E15 in. I put E10 in all my stuff like that. It works great. But if I only had 2 tanks, that's what I do, because then you have that option that's the lowest cost, that is going to be 98% of your sales. And then you have the high octane option and the ethanol free option for people who want that. I think, like I said, I think you're going to eventually, the labels are going to get real simple, because you're not going to have non-ethanol by E10 ethanol, by E15 ethanol. You're just going to have E15. It's the new norm.
Monte Shaw, Executive Director with the Iowa Renewable Fuels Association. Hey, we just have a minute or 2 left. Wanted to talk one last note with some of the releases of the ethanol production and inventory reports that we get every week. There's been a bit of a dip, a pretty significant low in inventory and weaker production over the last couple weeks, both in Midwest and nationally. But is that a normal thing for this time of year?
Yeah, sometimes first of all, I just always put a disclaimer on that weekly data. Sometimes it'll be like, oh, huge drop in supplies or huge spike in supplies, and then the next week it disappears. I sometimes think there must be some unit trains of ethanol in transit, so they're not at the supplies aren't at either place, and you get these wacky numbers, and they kind of even out by the time you look at the monthly data. But also, this is what we call shutdown time, and what that means is usually twice a year. Refiners do it, we do it, a lot of manufacturing type, especially in the fuel industry, do it. You need to do routine maintenance, and some of that you cannot do while the plant is operating. So it's also not pleasant to do when it's cold. So this is a typical time of year, for the last couple of weeks, for the next couple of weeks, where there's 200, 250 ethanol plants in the United States, and they will all go through a shutdown. Some of those are real short, 3 days, 5 days, if the plant's running great and they don't have any major upgrades, but they're down that long, and that's enough. When you have dozens of plants down for 3 days, it's going to show up in those numbers. And some last longer. Some are 2 or 3, maybe 1 or 2 weeks if they're, maybe they're doing some debottlenecking or stuff at the same time they're shut down. So this is a typical year where you start to see that lag in production. And then everybody, the goal is to have everybody up and going, because obviously the summer driving season is coming, and usually have stronger demand then. So there can always be different things going on in the market too, but this is a seasonal time where we see these shutdowns and maintenance periods.
Monte Shaw, Iowa Renewable Fuels Association Executive Director, joining us. Thank you so much for your time today.
Anytime. Thank you.
All right, let's take a look at the close for Thursday in the marketplace, and it appears to be a mixed trading session, although very nice day in livestock. We'll start off in grain, though. May corn down 2 cents, 4.39. July rising a penny and 3/4, 4.47.5. Soybeans in May 6 1/4 cents higher at 10.36 3/4, with July rising 5 3/4 at 10.45. Soybean meal in May down 20 cents a ton at $287.80. May wheat down a nickel at $5.13. July falling a nickel as well at $5.29 1/4. In livestock market, close for Thursday, June live cattle up $1.72, a hundredweight $214.25. August rising $1.62 at $210 even. Feeder cattle in May $3.02, a hundredweight more at $297.47. August rising $2.65 at $301.25. In the lean hog market close, May down half a dollar, $90.65. June fell 15 cents on hundredweight at $97.17. That is the Thursday market close here on the Farm Here Daily podcast, a Field Forward podcast. And we have with us now Rebecca Vittetoe, ISU Extension agronomist over in the eastern part of the state here on the Farm Here Daily podcast. Thank you so much, Rebecca, for joining us. And let's just go over some of that planting progress on the eastern part of the state. What have you seen?
Yeah, thanks for having me. So we're making good progress planting-wise. We kind of got an earlier start the first part of April. A lot of people were able to get in the field. It seemed like a fair amount ended up starting with beans this year. And then we saw quite a bit of beans and corn going in the ground. We did kind of have a couple week period there where we were wet, just like other parts of the state. And it seemed like, we'd barely get just about ready to go back to the field again, and then we'd get another little bit of rain. So it kind of stalled some field activity. But people are getting back in the field. There's a few areas where it might still be a little bit tacky and conditions aren't quite fit, but making really good planting progress over here. Definitely over the hump as far as planting goes, over 50% for both corn and soybeans. Some neighborhoods, it might even be almost done planting. Other neighborhoods might not be quite that far along, but I expect, especially with the weather forecast for this week, that we'll see a lot of progress made.
Do you have any producers calling in, asking some questions at this time of year?
Yeah, so a couple of the questions that we've been getting this time of year, I've been getting, are a little bit more pest related. So one of them, not specifically for corn and soybeans, but in alfalfa, I've had quite a few questions about alfalfa weevil this spring. And I think a lot of it goes back to last spring. We saw huge alfalfa weevil pressure in this part of the state, where a lot of alfalfa fields ended up having to be sprayed or cut early because of the pressure we saw. I think people are just remembering that from last year. At least the fields that I've checked so far this year, they haven't been at threshold where we would need to do anything. But I've had questions about that just because I think it's on people's mind from last year. Another one that I've had some questions on is what we're seeing for black cutworm and armyworm, more so moth activity. And so we did actually just yesterday post our predicted cutting dates for black cutworm around the state. We've had enough significant flights that we could kind of estimate when we would maybe expect the cutworm larvae to be big enough where they could potentially cut our corn plants. So for this part of the state, that predicted cutting date is May 17th.
I want to return to that alfalfa weevil note that you made, because I remember that being pretty bad last year as well. Is there any preliminary signs that it could be bad again so far? It may not be at thresholds yet where you need to cut, but can you take a glimpse at what's going on there, or is there not enough evidence yet?
At least the fields that I've checked, like I can find the larvae out there in the fields, but not at numbers, at least the fields I've checked, not at numbers where I'm thinking we need to do anything. Now, every field's a little bit different, so I don't want to say we're not going to have an issue and then somebody does. So it's always important to, scout with alfalfa weevil. Sweep net's an easy way to check to see if it's there in the field, but then to actually determine if we're at threshold, because it's a dynamic threshold. It's based off of our height of our alfalfa, the control costs, and then also our value of our hay. So it's a dynamic threshold. But how we actually determine if we're at threshold is we want to go out to 5 different areas in the field, collect 6 stems from those different areas, and then actually count how many larvae are on the stem. The easiest way to do that is kind of bang them in a 5 gallon bucket and actually count how many larvae fall off the stems. And then we've got a nice table that we can use to determine, okay, how many larvae are we seeing on these 30 stems? Are we at threshold? So I think that's kind of a misconception, because I'll get pictures of a sweep net and it's like, oh, you have them there, but now you need to go do this to actually determine if we need to do something. The other thing I would say, especially with alfalfa this spring, a lot of that alfalfa is getting pretty tall. Already. And so I think we'll see some earlier alfalfa harvest. I know a lot of people, as a general rule of thumb, will use like Memorial Day weekend is when they typically take that first cutting. But it wouldn't surprise me if we see stuff happening even later next week already, with first cutting just where we are with our alfalfa this year.
On the condition side of both alfalfa and also some of the early emergence, how has that been looking so far? I know for the last year we've had kind of an on again, off again relationship with drought.
Mm-hmm. So at least from a drought perspective over in this part of the state, we are sitting pretty good, especially compared to, I know, Northeast Iowa, they have been dry and they've been a little bit wetter here lately. And then parts of Western Iowa are still dry, but over here in at least the counties that I cover in Iowa, we've been very fortunate that we were able to get some rains last fall to help start to replenish that soil moisture. And then we've had decent rains here this spring to replenish that soil moisture. So from that perspective, we're sitting pretty good, especially compared to maybe where we were a year ago. Obviously, things can change during the growing season, but right now we're sitting pretty good. As far as just kind of how the crops are looking, in general, a lot of the forages that I've looked at, they're looking really good. There are some pastures you can tell that they've been overgrazed just with the drought the last couple of years. Those are, slower to get a lot of height or a lot of kind of growth on them here this spring. But there are also some pastures that they've had some decent growth, but they weren't as overgrazed. And then as far as, the corn and the soybeans that are up, I mean, everything that was planted kind of in that first window, that first part of April, that stuff is up. And in general, it's looking really good. I haven't had any major issues or calls about, seeing, widespread issues with like seedling disease. Not to say that that's not out there in areas, but in general, stands are looking pretty good. But now's the time to kind of go out and evaluate those stands. I have had a few questions, especially as beans were maybe coming through there, having some herbicide splash up on the hypocotyl and some burning on that. Nothing, major, but that's one thing that I have had a few questions on. But always good to get out and check and see what our stands are actually looking like before we get too far into the growing season.
Definitely an emphasis on getting out and scouting at this time of year is what you're saying.
Yep. Just see how the stands are looking. I know I've heard a few comments about some seed corn maggot activity, especially in some of that earlier planted stuff that might impact some stands. Bean leaf beetles are out there; they're active, and at least when we looked at bean leaf beetle mortality across the state, this part of the state had the lowest mortality. We were just around 50% mortality. So compared to other parts of the state where it was closer to 70%, which that 70% is more typical of what we see. So might potentially see some bean leaf beetle feeding on especially those early planted beans. Typically, it's not enough of an issue that we need to do anything with, but especially if we have seed beans or something food grade, it's more of a concern because they also can carry a virus that can impact seed quality as well.
Does ISU Extension have any resources that help folk identify that as they're scouting?
Yes, so probably our best go-to resource is we've got our integrated crop management website. Where we post a lot of information as far as like what we're seeing right now during the growing season. Plus, there's a lot of good just reference material of things. So that's a good go-to resource. We also have some of our physical resources, our field guides that you can get from the extension store. We've got our corn and soybean field guide. It's kind of a pocket size that it's nice you can carry out in the field with you. that can help to identify, a lot of the common, insects or diseases that we would see, or other even nutrient deficiencies or other issues we might see in corn and soybeans as well.
Rebecca Vittetoe, Iowa State University Extension Agronomist over in the eastern part of the state. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you for joining us on Farm Here Daily, a Field Forward podcast. Again, in order to keep producing this type of local Iowa content, we'd love to have you join our community. Please follow the podcast as well as our social media channels at Field Forward. Additionally, you can find me on social media at Geiger Reports, as well as WHO TV Channel 13 every day in their morning and noon hour programs. Again, I am your host, David Geiger. I'll be back again tomorrow, everybody.